Hello, this is Max Drake. I just want to talk about the designing of this and getting an operating compiled version of it for putting out there to share with others. So this one I've ended up calling it Time Capture. What I had to do was start thinking about how I was doing that, because the actual program itself is going to be in an exe file. You can't do any writing to that. So one of the things I ended up doing was for the projects was to write an ini. So when they ended up with project codes, so if we just go back into the L3 through there and we come down for the project codes through here, that would be written to an ini file. But when you actually run, if you go and update them, you actually want to delete that ini file and create them again. The next part was actually to do two things, which was one, to be able to allow them to create, or allow users to create their own file of where they want to put it. But you also needed a default file to actually be there at the beginning. So if they just ran the program straight away, you don't want it to break. You actually want it to be able to run, and then they can actually tailor it to their own needs. The same thing occurs with hotkeys. Now, I'd like them. I'm a lefty, so hotkeys that are good for me are on the left side of the keyboard. But a lot of other people might want right-handed hotkeys. So whatever maps on that side, whatever their preferences are, maybe they just use the left one like me. So I didn't want to actually force them into using something. So in some ways, there's a kind of a user experience of the program itself. I haven't changed much. All I've actually done is actually just allow for them to actually choose a project to actually write up against the file. The other thing that I've done is actually just made it a comma-separated file, instead of a comma-separated values instead of a tab-separated values. That way it can actually be a CSV and loaded up. So it's loaded up into a spreadsheet quite easily. It just triggers straight away. Overall, the program hasn't changed, but I ended up with an awful lot of complications and things that I ended up having to do just because it was a compiled program. And suddenly I thought, well, I'm used to just doing the little fun things. I'll find something, I'll find a few bits of code, I'll stitch them all together, and I'll find something and I get them to work. But it's usually dirty code in that it doesn't have to, if it breaks, that's fine. I can go in there and actually just fix it as I go along. But this one, because I'm compiling it and trying to make it as generic as possible so that other people can use it, I want them to be able to apply their own bespoke things to it, so that they write their own files, so that they actually have their own hotkeys and things like that. And that's caused a whole load of problems. It did cause problems. They were just challenges that I actually found that I haven't really had to address before. Also, as well as that, at the end of it, I ended up putting it onto onto GitHub, and then I actually had to do a little explanation of how it worked through there. Now, I haven't been on GitHub for a while, and this is what actually knocks me out a bit, is that because I haven't been doing some things for so long, I've forgotten how to do them. People who are actually working the same work every day, you sort of know what to do, and this is what sort of throws me with my coding, is that my coding gets quite advanced with some program or another, then I leave it and I don't touch it again for a year, 2 years, and then I come back to it and I'm sort of starting off at the very beginning again. One of the issues which I actually had in here was, so the two things that I ended up doing for developing this was I ended up with an ini file which was just for the project codes. So if sometimes they might have 10 projects and then the next time they have 20 projects and then they go back to 10, if you overwrite the same file, you're going to get residual mess coming through. So I wanted it so the best thing to do is blow away the ini file and create a new one. So every time it reads from that, it's reading whatever's valid. Since been a slight issue with that is that halfway through, if you're running the program all the time and you go and load up some more project codes, it writes them to the ini file, but it doesn't upload them. You need to refresh the program. So that's a little bug that I've actually just got to go and actually sort out as to how to refresh the program after they've actually uploaded the new project codes. The second thing which I actually found, I had an awful lot of trouble with hotkeys. Now, when you actually do your hotkey, what you end up doing is you assign a variable to the hotkey. And what I'm doing is that I'm writing that to an ini file so that when you shut down the program and you open it up again, it's reading those hotkeys again. Now, when I read up about them and I said, oh, well, this is how you actually ended up doing the hotkey. You use this terminology, hotkey. You go and get the variable and you assign it, you give a label, and the label is the same as if that was the label might have been, my original label might have been an alt 7, which was the hotkey for actually running that, but instead we've actually got the label which now triggers those programs off each time. So that's what, but what I was actually finding, I could run it in different programs, but when I tried to run it into this one, it wouldn't work at all. And so what I ended up doing was I ended up writing a whole script separately to actually just test the whole ini file out, just to get it to the way that I wanted, and the pop-ups to actually do the changes and everything like that. And I got all of that functioning, and I thought, great, I can actually just paste that into my other code now, and that'll work beautifully. Pasted it into the other code, into the main program which I got, and it didn't work at all. And I found when I used the hotkeys it worked, but when I found I was using the labels, it wasn't working at all. So what I ended up having to do was I ended up having to do the total quotes, the /* and then the */ so that I could actually comment out a whole lot of things. And I commented out the whole code, then just opened up bits by bits, stepped through either particular functions or whatever of the code or parts of loops and things like that. And I worked my way all the way down until I found the bit that was actually breaking it. And of course, it ended up having to be the last bit. And this is one of the things of I'd use somebody else's code. So I wasn't that familiar with it. And one of the items that it had right at the very end that seemed to break the things was this #if_win_active. And I tried it with the current pop-up and things like that. And in the end, I just found that I didn't actually need that in the program, so I took it out completely. And then it worked fine. So I didn't actually go and explore why it wasn't working. I just found something. I was getting a bit frustrated with the program, so I just fixed it by just removing this last bit through here. So that took a little bit of a time to actually work out. And then the next one was the menu files. So on the latest one, I actually have some menu files going through. And on here, one of the things which I haven't been able to do yet is if I just go and look in the tray for the program that's running, I've got all of these items so that I can actually run these labels, which are through here. They're the ones that are actually assigned to the hotkeys. So I can actually run them individually through here. The only problem what I'd like to do is that I'd like to do an about item or a link to a video of the tutorial on it, and I can't find how to do a link. Now you can do a link if it's just a normal general menu or GUI, but you can't do it in here, so I haven't quite figured that out. But what I've got through here is adequate for what I actually need. Somebody can actually go through and run that from that particular point in time. So the hotkeys now this was another thing that I had. So I had one ini file that did the project codes, and this one of the things that I was finding was it was skipping through a few lines, so I needed to figure out the total lines from the code just to make sure it didn't skip too far, and that stopped that. That took a little bit of debugging. And with the ini file, what I actually found was I didn't want to delete this file at all, ever. All I needed to do, because I was actually just creating a new file for where it was going to write to, it would just write over that name each time. So if somebody chose a different file name for it, or a different file date or whatever, that would do that. And then also the hotkeys. I actually needed my hotkeys to be operating at all times. So I needed the first thing for this program to do, even if it was running for the very first time. So this was something that I actually had to think about. If you ran the program for the very first time, could you use hotkeys? Well, you actually had to initiate them. So what you actually had to do is, if that file wasn't there, then you actually had to create the file, and you actually had to create a file where it could actually put things. Now later on, you can suddenly say, I actually want to put my files in this file. Sorry, I want to put all of my times in this file over here. But the first time you run it, you may not have actually created that file. So you needed a fallback file, which was a default that you actually had. So there's this thing of it actually creates a default before it goes through and does things. Then you can go through and choose to do those other things. But if you don't do them, not a problem. The hotkeys are still running, and the default file path's all there, and that's running the thing. I made a conscious decision not to put in any project names at all. So it's forcing people to go up and actually create a file for actually putting their project names in, because the whole idea of this program is that it works for specific people. So it has to be their project codes that they need to put in. So I left a whole lot of blanks, so it really worked just like the original Joy's original program at the beginning. So if you didn't put any project names in at all, project codes in, it would just be you'd actually have to put it on the line. So it really wasn't doing anything apart from allowing you to map a few hotkeys and deciding which files you were doing. Another thing that took me a little while to do was I ended up having to use the string go and edit the string itself of the actual file that they created, because something that was quite important to me is anytime they created a file of where they were writing the information to, I wanted to create a backup file as well. Now the backup file isn't something they can necessarily edit, but it was there so that they could actually do it. A further item as well is that you know, depending on the style of how you use it, like you could just, as soon as you come in the morning, you fire the thing up and you choose a project and you just leave that fellow. So you've got a start time of when that project's actually started. Don't have to put anything in there. And then when you start a different project, you just start another one, and then the first one actually just you've got the start time of that, and you've got the start time of the next one, so you can decide how much time you spent in between. I was using Hilbert's desktop timer and clock, but he shared that as a script, so I actually had to compile it so that it was an actual exe that people could run and use. So that was another little thing that I actually had to add on there. I think I've got it. Have I got it still running through here? No, I haven't got it running at this point in time. So that's something that they'd actually need to run and use that timer if it needed to do. So suddenly that was an extra little bit that I had to play with. And then I thought I wanted it up on GitHub because I'd most probably be updating and doing a few things to it, but I wanted the whole thing accessible so that with also the commentary on how to actually do it as a help file in a way of this is the information. It was recognition of who was actually where I got the information from, project, my expectations, and what I did. And really all I was trying to do at this point in time is make something transportable. I love auto hotkeys, and I just run most of my things off scripts. If you just looked in my tray through here, all of the ones, I've got a few of these scripts just running up at this point in time. I haven't bothered to compile them because I find if I need to do something, I can just tweak an improvement here and there and do something else with them. And that works for me fine. but I wanted to be able to make something that I could then share with other people that didn't actually have the order hotkey. And I actually found that there was a few challenges. You know, the fact that I actually had to make menus, the fact that I actually had to allow them to be able to order the hotkeys, the fact that they could actually write, they could upload their own project codes, the fact that they could actually choose which file that they did it. And if you've got a compiled thing, that's not an easy thing to do. Very easy to do inside your code. You can actually just suddenly saying, okay, then I'm going to actually write it to a new file through here. So you just go to the very beginning where all those variables are and actually just write them in here. It's dead easy to do. You don't. It's a no-brainer, but it's not as easy. And with that, another thing that I actually found inside the program, there's one called Out7 where you can remap your keys. Now, when you remap your keys, if I go Control and it goes blank and you go OK, it will store these keys with whatever's in here. But if there's a blank, it breaks the program again. So that was another thing that I actually had to consider. How you know, because you're not giving anybody any control to come in and actually tweak things, although I am actually sharing the actual script on there as well. You've got to make sure that you fix those bugs in a way. And this particular bug here is that what I actually had to do is if there wasn't a hotkey assigned to a hotkey, in other words, out3 was assigned to nothing, it would break. So I then had to go through and do a loop somewhere along here, as if the variables, if there isn't a variable, then he assigned the original one back to what it was already. So that was another thing that I ended up actually having to actually think out and do, and it was only by testing it out and doing it that I found it. But the debugging of the hotkeys of actually just commenting out the whole of the script and then just working my way through, testing the keys all the time until I found the label that just wasn't working and why it wasn't working, that took an awful long time. And in fact, I was thinking if I was doing that a year ago, I would have just quit. I would have just suddenly thought, I can't get this thing to work. I don't understand why it worked. That I hadn't learnt different strategies of how to do some different debugging. And I'm sure it isn't the normal debugging way. It's just a way that works for me. And I'd figure out something that I could do. I did lots and lots of message boxes to test different things as I went through to step just to make sure that certain things are going through. But I did find this a bit of a challenge overall, but I'm very pleased to do it, and I can actually, I think I got a lot of pleasure out of it the first couple of days of getting the program, getting the concepts, getting the ideas and everything like that. But I've spent a couple of days debugging things, or maybe even 3 or 4 days at the end of, you know, the first bit was getting the code of the initial code, and then it was just actually debugging that code until it actually worked and worked in without nothing else. Now, a further thing I'd actually just like to comment on this is that I ended up doing a few elaborations. Like I actually wanted to make sure that I ended up with a backup file, and that was a little bit of a pedanticism. So that was an extra tweak. So I ended up making it more elaborate than what it needed to be. But that was just something that I wanted to do. So I accepted that I was going to spend a bit more time on this than what I'd actually planned to do. The other thing was I was doing a PWA, so the Progressive Web App, and I was going through some tutorials and I was trying to replicate an app which was just doing an expensive with JavaScript. And I got 3/4 of the way there, and as it developed further it got complicated because there's all these odd instances that I ended up having to manage. And I got 3/4 of the way there and it was working quite fine. But then it would broke all the time, and whatever I was doing, the last 25% or 10% or whatever it was, I wasn't quite satisfied with it. I didn't feel comfortable about sharing it with anybody else because it was broken. It didn't quite work. My coding skills weren't good enough for that, and I do find JavaScript a bit challenging. This one I did find, it kind of went a little bit haywire, but I actually found I got the level of complexity that I wanted in the program, and it still has a robustness about it. Now, there's a couple of issues that I've got that I've identified when reloading the new projects. It requires a refresh, and the tray context menu, I just want to show the original hotkeys of what they were before people remap them. and that's really just so that when they first start off they can actually see. So down in the tray, when somebody actually looks on the image, I'm just going to put the L3 at the end, just so that people know what the initial thing is, just as a help prompt. Later on they may not become valid, but that's because people are most probably familiar with them if they choose to use the program. Now I think it's quite a nice program, and it's just simple and easy and just runs in the background. So I'm pleased with what I've done. I'm a bit disappointed that it took as long as it did, but I decided that it was important that I actually persevered with it. I've got another project I'm supposed to be doing, but I suddenly thought, no, I'm going to stick with this because it's just something that I'd like to get finished and out the way. And it's one of those things that I think you had to focus on it and just work through it, because if I'd have stepped back, left it and suddenly thought I'll come back to this later, I most probably wouldn't have. I would have brought it down to a more simplistic level than what I've actually got. But the goals that I set out to achieve and all of the items that I got in my list of what I wanted to do, I actually did in the end. The only things that I feel I haven't quite achieved is I haven't got a link, and I haven't got a sort of a help file of whether I can link back to a page somewhere, maybe on my website somewhere, that I can actually just have a help page or a documentation page about it. That would be something I'd be interested in doing if I was actually doing a program. And it was fun to do, and like I've just put it as version 1.00. I'm going to develop these other ones and upversion it and try and see if I can do a little bit of versioning as well. That is the other idea of actually having it to GitHub. If I update the things, I can actually just push them through. One of the things that I found actually a total doddle, and that was the compile. The compile went exactly as it should have. I found that was very smooth to do. So I hope that's been of interest to you. It's more just somebody who's not a great coder, who kind of keeps on coming. I do so many different things that I never get familiar enough. I'm not doing it on a day-to-day basis, but I actually really pleased with auto hotkey of how I can actually develop useful tools that are actually transportable and given and usable by other people. This one, like this is Joy's, this Yev Elson one, and the Hilbert's clock stopwatch, I think, are brilliant tools as well. So I've got great admiration for people who actually do better coding than mine. But hopefully the other one as well that I try to do as well is to put in a few comments to make it a little bit more an explanation of what I'm doing in some of the things. Normally I wouldn't even bother commenting at all. So this time, because I've been looking through the code, and the code at the end of this particular code, or the file of the compiled file at the end of the day, is only 300 lines, 294 lines. So that's quite interesting. Thank you very much for watching. I hope that's been of interest to you. And this is from an ignoramus coder who struggles to try and do things. Thank you very much for watching.